Hello, my name is Ilana Braverman, and I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer at Greener by Default. I'm also a board member at the Center for Jewish Food Ethics. Thank you for joining me today. Our mission at Greener by Default is to consult with institutions to help them apply behavioral science to food policy, nudging diners towards sustainable, plant-based foods while preserving freedom of choice. Today, during the Sustainable Dining Training Part 2, I'll be going over simple strategies that you can use in a variety of different dining environments to make it easier for your diners to eat delicious and sustainable meals. To start off today, I wanted to discuss nudge theory. What is nudge theory? First, a nudge is a subtle intervention applied to an environment that aims to influence our choice or behavior. We can implement nudges in communal dining settings to shift meals to be more sustainable and inclusive by default. And I'll start with an overview of what some of those nudges are. So at your top left here, you can see we'll start with our highest impact strategy, the plant-based default. And then later in this presentation, we'll talk about other nudges, such as changing the ratio to make it more climate friendly, subtly substituting certain ingredients into dishes, placing items in different positions to make it easier for diners to choose them, making sure everything sounds delicious and that our names are descriptive, and reducing the proportion of animal protein and increasing the amount of plant protein on our plates. To start off today, though, we're going to start with the plant-based default. So first, what does that mean? A default option is the one that people end up with if they don't make an active choice. One example of this that I like to share with folks is a ringtone. So for example, when you get a new phone, if you don't select your ringtone, you end up with the default choice. And if I were to call everybody's phone in an audience at one time, most of us would probably have stuck with that default choice. So again, it's something you don't go out of your way to choose differently unless you really, really want to. And another example of this is with organ donation. So as you can see on the countries represented here on the left, these are countries where you have an opt-in system. So you have to self-select yourself to become an organ donor. And they, as you can see, under 40% of people in all of these different countries have decided to be an organ donor, whereas the countries on the right represented here in green have opt-out policies. So everyone is an organ donor by default unless you choose to opt yourself out. And you can see how vastly different the uptake rates in these different countries are just based on their default policies. And so fortunately, this same idea works for food. So when you serve a meal where the plant-based option is the default choice, it's most convenient, it seems more appealing, and when people can still opt in to select a meal with meat, fish, eggs, or dairy if they choose, we're normalizing that plant-based option and making it the socially acceptable, delicious option for everyone to have. And when this happens, it is just much more likely that someone is going to try a plant-based meal because it seems like something everybody is doing. And it's clear that the energy that the chef has spent has been put into this primary meal instead of in a typical setting where a vegan or a vegetarian or somebody who wants to try more plant-based foods has to simply request that additional meal and not really know what it's going to be or something like that. So that's the idea of a plant-based default meal. The benefits of serving plant-based by default are vast, but four of the main ones are: one, it's a simple choice that you can make that swap and make it a selection for your diners to eat that plant-based meal more easily. It's flexible, it can work in different dining environments. It's cost-effective in many contexts when you're swapping that meat for a whole foods plant-based protein, and it preserves freedom of choice for all diners. So it's not implementing a fully vegetarian policy. It's just saying we're going to make this the default option, and diners who want something else can still ask for that. We've also worked with many different institutions, and here's an example of a dining hall that served their main line as a plant-based meal by default, and the diners could choose to add on an animal protein to their meal, and the food costs and labor costs were less expensive than they were in a traditional dining hall setup. Another benefit of serving a plant-based meal by default is that it is really inclusive. So milk is one of the top most common food allergies, which means about 1 in 20 people are actually allergic to milk, and many more are lactose intolerant. And it's estimated that 30 to 50 million Americans are lactose intolerant, as are over 50% of Ashkenazi Jews. So there are already so many people in our community who have trouble digesting dairy. So serving, plant-based dairy as the main option in many contexts is the most inclusive way we can serve our community. It's also true that more than half of Americans are trying to eat less red meat, and more than a third are already trying to eat more plant-based. It's much more widely known in today's society the impacts that our food choices have on the environment, on our health, on animals. And so people are already trying to make these choices, but oftentimes in many community settings, I'm sure many restaurants you can think of that you go to, make it really difficult to order a plant-based meal. So if we're making it easier for people to make those choices, we're doing a service to our community to help people make it easier to choose the meal that's healthier for them. And last but definitely not least, Americans of color are actually nearly 3 times more likely to be vegetarian than white Americans. So it is more inclusive from a cultural perspective, from a health perspective, and from an allergy and intolerance perspective to serve more plant-based meals. And also who's included in this are many of our younger members of our communities. So 60% of Gen Zers want to eat more plant-based foods. Almost 80% are already eating plant-based meals multiple times a week. Many of our households are consuming multiple types of milks, and almost all consumers who buy plant-based meats also buy animal-based meats. So it's really not just that we're saying, let's serve these meals for our vegan and vegetarian consumers and everyone else can eat them. We're trying to meet the general population where they're at and attract more younger consumers to our community events. To go into a little bit more about how this works, some of you might be wondering, this all sounds great, but what is actually the effect of serving a plant-based meal by default? We did a study a few years ago with a couple of universities where we changed the RSVP form for the event to either say, for some diners, I would like a meat meal, and if you'd like to opt in to a plant-based meal, you can check this box. And the other half of diners got the exact opposite request form, completely randomly selected. They had 2 options, which is that I would like the plant-based default meal, or I would like to opt in for the meat-based meal. And for the diners who received the quote normal form, where meat was the default, only 18% of people chose to opt themselves in to that plant-based meal and said, yes, I would like to select a plant-based meal. But when plant-based was the default option, and they had the option of opting themselves into the meat-based meal, we found that 66% of diners in this university setting for this study chose that the plant-based meal was okay. So this just goes to show that in a setting, again, where we are normalizing that plant-based meal, making it sound delicious, offering it to everybody and saying that it's the main option, you will have so many more diners who don't necessarily identify as vegan or vegetarian, but who are just okay eating whatever the main meal is at a community event as long as it tastes good. And many, flexitarians as well in our society today. So going back to what I said a bit ago about how we're not just trying to serve meals for vegans and vegetarians, I just wanted to share a bit of our opportunity for impact here. At our organization, we like to think about it as there are 2 sides here at the end of this bell curve, right? You have vegans on one side and meat lovers on another. The vegans and vegetarians are always going to request and go out of their way to ask for a plant-based meal because they need one to continue to eat along with their ethical values. On the other hand, you have meat lovers who, if they see a vegan meal, they might say, I don't want this. I'm definitely going to go out of my way to buy something separately or request a meal with meat. But in the middle, you have the majority of the population who is going to be okay with any type of meal that's served as long as it's delicious, appealing, and fulfilling. And so that's really the goal of this program, is to reach the diners who just want to eat good food and are happy to eat a plant-based meal in a community setting with their friends and their family, as long as it's delicious. So now that we've covered the main idea of plant-based defaults, I want to return to this original slide and just spend our last few minutes here going over some of the other strategies you can use in your dining environments if a plant-based default might not work for your particular dining setup. So to start off, climate-friendly ratios are a really great alternative to when a plant-based default isn't possible to set up. So for example, you might be serving a buffet at an upcoming event where you're not reaching out to diners ahead of time to ask what their preference is for the meal. Let's say you're serving 3 main courses or main proteins at this meal. What climate-friendly ratios is asking you to do is to make 2 of those plant-based. So again, still have that meat option for the diners who want it, but to make it easy and diverse for diners to choose something else. So oftentimes, we might have a taco bar and we might have beef, chicken, and tofu. And many diners aren't going to go for the tofu if they eat the other 2 options, or they might say, I'm going to save that for the vegans and vegetarians because I know that there's not a lot of that. And what we're doing here is trying to flip the script so that there's always multiple plant-based options to choose from, so that diners also can't just say, I don't like X, but they actually have multiple options. So maybe there's lentils and beans and tofu, or maybe there's a plant-based meat and a bean, so that if you don't like one of those things, there's another option for you. So instead of at your next event serving egg salad and tuna salad and bagels with cream cheese, maybe you can consider serving a pasta salad with roasted vegetables, chickpea salad, and then your bagels with cream cheese, and also having a dairy-free spread. So again, you're changing up what you're serving, but you're not changing the overall idea around it. And you're giving diners a choice to maybe try something new, and also give them that idea that plant-based can be delicious and fulfilling and diverse in these different dining settings. Our next strategy is called subtle substitutions, and this is pretty simple. This is the idea of serving plant-based condiments, milks, desserts, and breads by default. So let's say you have a recipe for a cookie. Maybe you can sub out the milk or the eggs for a plant-based milk or flaxseed or applesauce according to the recipe. And this can be a real cost saver too. A school district that removed eggs and milk from their baked goods a few years back found out that they saved over $10,000 annually, and as much carbon as driving over 50,000 miles. So for refreshments and catered meals, you might try offering oat milk for coffee, egg salads made with a plant-based mayonnaise, or bagels with a plant-based cream cheese. And I just want to say there that example of serving an egg salad with a plant-based mayonnaise might seem a little silly, right? Oh, I'm still using eggs, but I can use a plant-based mayonnaise. That's what this strategy is really all about. It's not about making everything plant-based. It's about what are some ingredients in different dishes that you could swap out a plant-based substitute and maybe make that dish a bit more plant-forward, even if it isn't fully plant-based. So, swapping out the butter or the milk in a recipe that might otherwise have dairy or eggs in it is one step in the right direction. For our next strategy called prime placement, this is the idea of making sure that plant-based items are first, front, and center on main menus and buffet lines. So in that example I gave before about if you're having an upcoming buffet, this is making sure that those 2 plant-based dishes, or however many you're serving, are front and center when people walk in. So instead of having the meat and then having those plant-based items off to the side. Make sure that they are first when people walk in. Next is one of my favorites, just because it's so easy and it can have such a big impact, is tasty titles. The idea of labeling dishes with enticing names that stimulate our senses and focus on ingredients rather than the term vegan. I'm sure many of you have been to an event or seen a menu where it says vegan pasta or vegan lasagna, and you're left asking yourself, what's in it? I know, maybe I know now that it's vegan, but what type of cheese is it going to have? What type of vegetables? What type of a dish is it? And so the idea here is to think about what's actually in that dish. So instead of this pastry being called vegan pastry, we can just call it strawberries and cream pastry and make sure that that little V is there at the end to show that the dish is plant-based, but to not make that the sole descriptor of the dish. So some examples might be, instead of a dairy-free or a parve mandel bread, we can just say chocolate pecan mandel bread with a little V. Instead of a vegan hummus wrap, why don't we look at what's in this hummus wrap? So for example, it could be a roasted red pepper and creamy avocado hummus wrap with roasted chickpeas or something like that to make it more flavor forward about that dish. And then it just so happens to be vegan. And you put that, make sure to put that little V in the title so that the people who do need to know for allergen or dietary preferences have that information. It's just not the main descriptor on that dish. And last but not least, the last strategy we'll cover today is meat reduction. This is a good one when you have an audience that might not be ready for fully trying new plant-based meals, or maybe you want to add one but not multiple. An idea here is to reduce the actual amount of meat that's in a dish. So for a burrito, for example, instead of a whole scoop of meat and then maybe some lettuce and tomato, call it a day, you could mix that meat with beans or rice or other vegetables so that it still has meat in it, but the smaller the portion, the less of the carbon impact, the more plant-based proteins you can fill into that dish, the more cost savings for you potentially, and you can even diversify the flavor profile of that dish. So there was a recent study done at Stanford where they found that the portion size of meat in burritos could actually be reduced by 25% with no decrease in diner satisfaction. That is it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for part 2 of the Sustainable Dining Training. To wrap up, I just want to leave you with one last message. It's important to implement nudge strategies that align with your community's resources, goals, and dining structure. And CJFE is thrilled to work with you to make changes that are attainable and realistic so that they can be sustained over time. That is the most important thing to this work, is picking something that works for you. Next, please complete the activity and look at these sources for further reading. Thanks.